The night my daughter-in-law introduced me to her family, she laughed when she said my name. Not a warm laugh. Not the kind that pulls people together around a table. It was the kind that puts someone beneath one, quick and dismissive, like brushing crumbs off a sleeve. She said, "This is my father-in-law, Walter. He used to fix boilers for a living." Then she turned back to her mother and kept talking. The table moved on. I stayed where I was, holding a glass of sparkling water, standing at the edge of a dining room that probably cost more to furnish than my first house. I didn't say anything. I never do. My son Michael caught my eye from across the table. He gave me a small nod, the kind we'd exchanged 100 times over the years, the kind that meant, "I see it, Dad." "I'm sorry." I shook my head slightly. It didn't matter. It really didn't. I was 63 years old. I had stopped needing anyone's approval a long time ago. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how that evening began, and why, by the time dessert arrived, the entire room had gone completely silent. My son Michael married Courtney 3 years ago. She's a beautiful woman. Sharp eyes, sharper tongue, and the kind of ambition that fills a room before she walks into it. I'd liked that about her when they first started dating. I told Michael she reminded me of someone I used to know. He asked who. I said, "Me, about 40 years ago." He laughed. I don't think Courtney ever found that particularly funny. From the beginning, she was polite to me the way people are polite to furniture, careful not to bump into it, not particularly interested in its history. At their wedding, she'd introduced me to her colleagues as Michael's father, the way you might say, the cars in the garage. Accurate, functional, nothing more. I lived alone in Millhaven, a small town in western Pennsylvania, about 2 hours from where Michael and Courtney had settled in Pittsburgh. I had a modest house on Caldwell Street, 2 bedrooms, a garden that got good light in the morning, a porch where I drank my coffee every day regardless of the season. I drove a 2009 Ford pickup that I maintained myself. I wore flannel shirts. I fixed things when they broke, when the neighbors needed help. A leaking pipe, a stuck window, a furnace that rattled in the cold. They knocked on my door. Courtney had been to my house exactly twice. Both times she'd looked around with the careful neutrality of someone who had been raised to be polite about poverty. I was not poor, but she didn't know that, and I never felt the need to tell her. The dinner that October was her parents' idea. Her father, Gerald, had recently sold a commercial property in Baltimore and wanted to celebrate with a family gathering at their home outside Philadelphia. Courtney's parents lived in a stone colonial on a cul-de-sac, where the lawns were kept by professionals, and the mailboxes were the kind that matched the shutters. Her mother, Patricia, had sent a formal invitation. An actual card, cream-colored, with engraved letters. I'd set it on my kitchen counter and looked at it for a few days before telling Michael I would come. "You don't have to," he said over the phone. "I know," I said. "I'll be there." I drove up on a Saturday morning and arrived before noon. Michael met me in the driveway. He looked relieved to see me and then, almost immediately, nervous, the way grown sons look when they've been caught between 2 worlds they can't reconcile. He hugged me hard, the way he used to when he was small. "How was the drive?" he asked. "Fine," I said. "Nice country out here." He carried my bag inside. I brought a bottle of Pennsylvania rye whiskey, a small batch distillery out of Allegheny County, the kind you had to know to find. I figured Gerald might appreciate it. I'd also brought a jar of honey from my neighbor Ruth's hives for Patricia. Michael looked at the gifts and didn't say anything, but he smiled. Courtney greeted me in the hallway with a hug that lasted exactly as long as it needed to and no longer. She was dressed beautifully. A deep green dress, her hair done, every detail considered. She looked me over once, took in the flannel and the boots I'd polished that morning, and smiled the way people smile in photographs. "Walter," she said, "glad you made it." "Good to be here," I said. Gerald and Patricia were warm people, in the way that people who have always been comfortable can afford to be warm. Gerald shook my hand with both of his and told me he'd heard I was a man who knew how to fix things. I said I'd spent enough years learning. Patricia accepted the honey with what seemed like genuine pleasure and set it on the kitchen counter like it belonged there, which I appreciated. The trouble started at dinner. There were 8 of us at the table: Gerald and Patricia, Michael and Courtney, Courtney's younger sister, Diane, and her husband, a corporate attorney named Paul, who had opinions about wine and wasn't shy about sharing them, and 2 of Gerald's old business associates who had apparently been invited because Gerald liked an audience when he had something to celebrate. Their names were Frank and his wife Eleanor. Frank had the handshake of a man who'd been important in a room for a long time and still needed you to know it. We sat down. The food was catered. Patricia had been clear about that, almost apologetic, as if cooking herself would have been the more dignified option. It was excellent. Roasted lamb, green beans with almonds, small roasted potatoes. Paul opened a wine he'd brought and explained its provenance to the table for longer than was necessary. I was seated between Michael and Diane. Diane was the quieter of the 2 sisters. Easier, warmer, with her mother's eyes and a laugh that arrived without warning. She asked me about Millhaven and seemed genuinely interested in my answers. I liked her. Then Frank, across the table, looked at me with the comfortable curiosity of a man who has always felt entitled to other people's stories. "So, Walter," he said, "what do you do?" I opened my mouth. Courtney, 2 seats down, answered first. "Walter worked in maintenance," she said, cutting her lamb neatly. "Industrial boilers mostly. He's retired now, but he still does handyman work around his neighborhood." She smiled at me, pleasant, conclusive, the kind of smile that means the subject is closed. "He's very handy." There was a small ripple of polite acknowledgement around the table. Patricia nodded. Gerald murmured something appreciative. Paul refilled his own glass. I said, "That's about right." And Frank nodded the way people nod when they've filed you under a category and moved on. "Good, honest work," he said with the particular condescension of a man who has never once fixed anything with his own hands. Michael was looking at his plate. I took a sip of water. The evening continued. Gerald talked about the property sale, a warehouse complex he'd held for 11 years and sold at 3 times the acquisition price. He was proud of it, and rightly so. Frank talked about a resort development he was involved with in South Carolina. Paul talked about Paul. Courtney, I noticed, did not miss an opportunity. When Gerald mentioned that he'd had trouble with the HVAC system at one of his properties, she said lightly, "You should have called Walter. He fixes everything." The table chuckled softly. She said it kindly. That was the thing that was hardest to argue with. She always said it kindly. When Frank asked whether I'd ever worked in commercial buildings, Courtney said, "Oh, Walter mostly does residential. Houses, apartments, smaller scale." She touched my arm briefly when she said it, affectionate, summarizing. I watched Michael's jaw tighten slightly. I put my hand on his arm under the table and shook my head just once. Not here, not tonight. The dessert came, a dark chocolate tart with a cherry glaze. Patricia poured coffee. The conversation had drifted to real estate markets, which was comfortable territory for everyone at that table except me. Or so Courtney believed. It was Frank's wife, Eleanor, who changed everything. She had been quiet for most of the meal, observant in the way that some people are when they're the smartest person at the table and don't feel the need to prove it. She'd asked good questions when she asked them. She had gray hair cut close and reading glasses pushed up on her head, and she had spent the last several minutes looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Now she set down her coffee cup. "Walter," she said. "What was your last name again?" "Braddock," I said. The room didn't change. But Eleanor's expression did. Her eyes sharpened. She looked at me the way people look at something they're trying to remember. Or rather, trying to confirm. "Braddock," she repeated. "Were you ever involved with a company called Vantage Industrial Supply?" The table was still carrying on its own conversation, but Courtney had heard. She turned her head slightly. I set down my fork. "I was," I said. "I started it." The side conversation stopped. Eleanor nodded slowly, the way people nod when a suspicion has been confirmed rather than surprised. "I thought so," she said. "I knew I recognized you. My brother worked the Youngstown district for you, early 2000s, Tom Hargraves. He used to talk about you, said you could rebuild a pressure valve in the dark." Frank had turned. Gerald had turned. Even Paul had stopped talking about Paul. I said, "Tom Hargraves. Of course. He was one of the best reps I ever had. Tell me he's well." "Semi-retired," Eleanor said. "He'll be sorry he missed this." She looked around the table with the calm authority of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and felt no need to rush it. "Vantage Industrial Supply," she said for the benefit of the room, was one of the largest independent industrial distribution companies in the Mid-Atlantic. Parts, systems, maintenance contracts, hospitals, universities, municipal utilities. She paused. "They sold to a private equity group in 2019, if I remember right. Significant transaction." Silence. I said, "That's correct." Gerald looked at me with new eyes. Not unkind, just recalibrating. Frank had put down his fork. Paul was very still. Courtney had not moved. I looked at her. I didn't look at her with anger. That had never been my way. I looked at her the way I'd learned to look at difficult situations over 60 years, directly, without flinching, but without cruelty either. "I started Vantage in 1987, I said, speaking to the table but watching my daughter-in-law. Rented a warehouse outside of Pittsburgh. Took on a business partner who lasted about 2 years, then ran it alone. 43 employees at the peak. We held contracts with 11 municipal systems and 4 university hospital networks." I paused. "When I sold, I was 60. I decided I didn't need a bigger house. I'd had bigger houses. I preferred the one I had." Michael was looking at me. His eyes were bright. "The truck outside," Frank said slowly. "The Ford? Gets me where I'm going," I said. Gerald laughed. A short, real laugh, the kind that surprises you out of your own chest. "Walter," he said, shaking his head, "I owe you a better pour than what Paul brought." There was scattered laughter. The tension broke the way ice breaks on a river, all at once in one long crack. Courtney did not laugh. I watched her sit very still at that table, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. I felt sorry for her. Not contempt, not satisfaction. Just a plain, quiet sorrow. Because I knew that what she was feeling in that moment wasn't really about me. It was about everything she'd assumed, all the calculations she'd made without checking her math, the careful architecture of a self-image that had just discovered an unexpected load. She was my son's wife. She would be for a long time, God willing. That mattered more than anything I could have said. Later, after Gerald and Frank had moved to the study for what turned into a 2-hour conversation that I was very glad to be part of, after Eleanor had taken my number and promised to tell her brother she'd found me, after Patricia had insisted I take the remaining tart home wrapped in foil. After all of that, Courtney found me on the back porch. The night was cool. The lights of the cul-de-sac were soft through the trees. I had my coffee and the quiet I'd been looking forward to since I arrived. She came out and stood beside me. She didn't speak right away. I didn't try to fill the silence. I've never been afraid of silence. At 63, you learn that silence is usually where the true things live. Finally, she said, "I didn't know." "No," I said. "You didn't." "Michael never—" "Michael knew," I said. "I asked him not to make a point of it. I've never liked being defined by it." She turned and looked at me then, really looked at me. Maybe for the first time since we'd met. Her eyes were different than they'd been at dinner. Not softer exactly, more honest. "Why didn't you say something?" she asked. "Tonight, when Because you weren't saying anything that needed correcting," I said. "I did work in maintenance. I did fix boilers. I did handyman work for the neighbors. All of that's true." I paused. "It's just not all of it." She was quiet for a long moment. I said, "I'm not easy to know, Courtney. I understand that. I don't fill in the blanks other people leave. Maybe that's a flaw." I picked up my coffee. "But I'm Michael's father. That's the part that doesn't change regardless of what's in my bank account or what I drive. If we're going to know each other, really know each other, that's probably the right place to start." She didn't say anything for a while. I didn't expect her to. People need time to rearrange things they've held a certain way for a long time. After a while, she said, "The neighbors, the ones you fix things for, do they know?" "Mrs. Kowalski next door has known me for 20 years, I said. "She brings me kielbasa at Christmas and argues with me about my tomatoes. I think that's probably enough." Something shifted in her face then. Not quite a smile, but close. The beginning of one, maybe. I thought about Michael when he was 7, sitting on the concrete floor of a rented warehouse in Pittsburgh, watching me sort parts and asking questions. I did my best to answer. I thought about the years of 12-hour days and missed school plays, and the look on his mother's face when she believed in what I was building, even when I wasn't sure I did. I thought about the morning I signed the papers selling Vantage and drove home in that same Ford and sat on the porch in Millhaven and felt, for the first time in a long time, like a man who could simply be still. I hadn't needed the world to know what I'd built. I'd needed to build it. That was different. "Come back inside when you're ready," I said to Courtney. "The night's still early." I finished my coffee. Above the cul-de-sac, the sky was clear and wide the way it gets in October, when summer has finally released its hold and the air has memory in it again. I stood there a little longer, just breathing it in. My son found me a few minutes later. He leaned against the railing and looked up at the same sky. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm good," I said. He nodded. We stood there together the way we always had, not needing to fill the space, just sharing it. That was something I'd managed to teach him, at least. Maybe the most important thing. "She'll come around," he said, not defending her, not apologizing, just stating what he believed. "I know she will," I said, and I meant it. The door opened behind us and the light and voices of the house spilled out into the evening, warm and unguarded, the way family sounds when it forgets to perform and just becomes itself. Gerald was laughing at something. Diane was asking where the decaf had gone. Patricia was telling someone to sit down. There was plenty. Michael and I looked at each other. "Hungry?" he said. "Always," I said, and we went back inside.